You're standing in a room where the velvet ropes of celebrity glamour have been yanked away, and what remains is a stark cage of accountability. Sean "Diddy" Combs, once the king of champagne-soaked parties, the mogul who could make or break careers with a phone call, is now flanked by federal marshals, his tailored suit looking less like power and more like armor against the cold reality of a courtroom. You feel the dissonance instantly. This isn't a red carpet, this is a stage where freedom itself is on trial. The name on everyone's lips is no longer a symbol of music and fashion, but of allegations, indictments, and the possibility of prison walls. Welcome, softly, to 102 Hours, where stories like these are whispered into your ears long after the headlines fade. You're invited to settle in, to sink into the rhythm of words and shadows. As you listen, drop your location and your local time below, because part of the mystery is knowing exactly where and when you re-tuning in. Like, subscribe, stay a while. Think of it as leaving your mark in the long hallway of echoes we're walking tonight. Now you lean closer. September 16th, 2024. That's when a federal grand jury indicted Combs on charges of racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, and transporting individuals across state lines for prostitution, charges rooted in the Mann Act, a law over a century old originally crafted to combat forced prostitution and so-called white slavery. Some historians point out that the Mann Act has been wielded unevenly in American justice, from prosecuting actual trafficking to ensnaring figures like heavyweight champion Jack Johnson in 1913, where the crime was crossing state lines with his consenting partner. The echoes of that history now rumble faintly as Combs sits accused under the same statute. You notice how the indictment landed like a thunderclap across the entertainment industry. Once lauded for turning street hustle into a billion-dollar empire, music labels, vodka deals, fashion lines, Diddy now found himself shackled not just physically but reputationally. Accusers stepped forward, alleging that behind the platinum records and luxury brand campaigns lurked coercion, manipulation, and exploitation. Allegations, not convictions yet, but serious enough to drag his legacy into a courtroom where jurors, not fans, would hold sway. Investigators still question whether the line between coercion and consensual participation was as clear as prosecutors insisted. The courtroom itself became a theater of contradictions. On one hand, the United States government marshaled evidence, recorded encounters, testimony from former associates, flights booked with precise dates and times. On the other, the defense painted a portrait of consensual adult activity, perhaps distasteful to some, but not criminal. They argued that the government was criminalizing celebrity excess. And here you are, as the listener, caught in the tension between spectacle and statute. There's something haunting about this moment. The way a man who built his career on amplifying voices now sits silent, his fate dictated by others. You can almost hear the muffled bass lines of 1990s hits. Can't nobody hold me down, bleeding faintly in memory, but here, those words feel cruelly ironic. The trial stripped Diddy of narrative control. In this space, only the judge's gavel and the jury's deliberation matter. The irony deepens when you think of how power consolidates. Music history is littered with tales of moguls. Phil Spector with his wall of sound and eventual murder conviction, Suge Knight's empire of intimidation and eventual imprisonment. Each story a cautionary tale that fame and fortune cannot insulate anyone forever. In the hushed tension of Diddy's trial, you're reminded that American culture thrives on building giants only to watch them stumble or fall. Yet there's a fringe detail worth savoring here. Outside the courthouse, a group of fans held a kind of vigil, not unlike the way devotees once camped outside Elvis's mansion or Michael Jackson's trial. Some blasted his old records, insisting that the music mattered more than the man. Others held homemade signs reading "Justice for Survivors." The sidewalk became its own jury box, split between devotion and outrage. A strange little carnival of belief and denial. And as you drift in this moment, the contrast sharpens. Velvet ropes, iron bars. The man once controlling VIP lists now finds himself on one he cannot escape. His name no longer guarantees access, but raises suspicion. That tension, that brutal reversal, is why this trial matters, and why you're here listening in the dark. You lean back, eyelids heavy, and feel the weight of unresolved questions pressing down. What actually happened behind the locked studio doors? Which stories will hold up under scrutiny, and which will unravel as memory and evidence clash? Tonight begins not with answers, but with atmosphere. The sense that even in the hush of midnight, power and its abuses still ripple outward. You picture the courthouse steps in Lower Manhattan, September 16, 2024. The morning air feels heavy, as if even the clouds pause to listen. News vans crowd the curb, cameras pointed like weapons, waiting for federal prosecutors to step out and announce the charges. You're standing in that crowd, leaning against the cold metal of a barricade, listening to the words that will define everything that follows. Racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking by force, fraud or coercion, and violations of the Mann Act. Suddenly, the empire that once ran on platinum albums and vodka endorsements sounds more like the plot of a crime drama than a business success story. The indictment is long, nearly 100 pages, filled with coded language and references to years of alleged misconduct. It's not a music contract, it's a blueprint of alleged exploitation. Prosecutors describe flights arranged not for touring, but for moving women across state lines. They point to a network of employees, security guards, and even assistants who allegedly helped conceal, arrange, or enable encounters. And here's the core of the matter: the law doesn't care how many hits you've produced, or whether you've sat courtside at the NBA Finals. The law cares whether you used power and money to control others. You think about the Mann Act itself. Passed in 1910, it was America's attempt to tackle forced prostitution, though it quickly became infamous for its misuse. Jack Johnson, the black heavyweight champion, was convicted for traveling with his white girlfriend, a case many historians now call a grotesque abuse of power cloaked as morality. That piece of legal trivia hangs over the present because investigators still question whether applying the Mann Act to celebrity excess blurs lines the way it once did over a century ago. In the indictment, prosecutors mention the phrase racketeering conspiracy. That's a term born out of the 1970 Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO for short. It's the same law once wielded against mob bosses and corrupt unions. Suddenly, a hip-hop mogul who built his brand on being larger than life is being legally compared to organized crime figures. That connection carries symbolic weight. For decades, hip-hop culture has flirted with the imagery of the underworld. Now, a prosecutor is trying to drag one of its most powerful architects into that very framework. But the indictment isn't just legal text, it's also theater. Every charge, every paragraph, every detail is designed to set the stage for trial and to tell jurors a story before the first witness ever steps forward. It speaks of control, coercion, fear, and entertainment presented as predation. You notice how each word seems chosen to hammer home a moral point, not just a legal one. And the ripple spreads instantly. Entertainment journalists blast headlines about the downfall of Diddy. Financial analysts speculate how many millions could evaporate from endorsement deals. Politicians quietly ask whether the trial will shape debates about sex trafficking legislation. In moments like these, you realize an indictment isn't just about one man. It's about the cultural machinery orbiting him. Fringe details always slip through in the chaos. A court clerk, overwhelmed by the surge of reporters, jokes quietly about never seeing so many designer shoes in a federal building. A security guard compares the scene to the Super Bowl of scandals. These aren't in the official record, but they re-part of the texture. Moments reminding you that history unfolds in both the serious and the absurd. For Combs, the indictment lands like a public unmasking. His lawyers call it baseless, a witch hunt, echoing defenses familiar to anyone following high-profile trials in America. They insist the government has confused consensual adult activity with criminal exploitation. But as you listen, you understand the real battle hasn't started yet. The indictment is the overture. The symphony of testimony, cross-examination, and evidence is still to come. You also sense the weight of history pressing down on this case. In American memory, there's a gallery of stars who went from adored to indicted. Michael Jackson's trials, R. Kelly's conviction, even Phil Spector's murder trial. Each case reshaped the way audiences thought about the music itself. You wonder whether Diddy's trial will leave a similar scar on hip-hop, a genre already used to accusations of glorifying excess and violence. The indictment marks the moment when a private reputation becomes a public reckoning. From this day forward, Sean Combs is not only a mogul, but also a defendant. Every move, every whispered courtroom aside, every document filed will be scrutinized by both a jury and an audience of millions. And as you absorb the tension of this day, you recognize the symbolism. Velvet ropes cut away, replaced by chains of legal text, paragraph by paragraph. The sky above the courthouse stays gray, a kind of neutral backdrop to history in motion. And you, standing in that crowd, realize you've just witnessed the fall of an empire's first domino. You close your eyes and picture a nightclub in the late 1990s. The bass line thumps through your chest, champagne corks pop like fireworks, and at the center of it all, Sean "Diddy" Combs is holding court. He's not just at the party. He is the party. A man who turned nightlife into a business model and his own persona into a cultural brand. Fast forward to 2025, and the same man who once made you believe in shiny suits and endless after-hours is now shackled by the weight of federal allegations. The transition is almost cinematic. From dance floor to defense table. The courtroom doesn't care about #1 hits or who produced them. It cares about charges, statutes, and evidence. Prosecutors allege that Combs orchestrated a pattern of behavior that wasn't glamorous at all, transporting women across state lines, creating situations where consent blurred into coercion, and blurring business with intimacy. The Mann Act, yes, that creaky century-old law again, becomes the centerpiece of his trial. You find yourself wondering how a rule first aimed at horse-drawn carriages and boarding houses can now decide the fate of a 21st century mogul. Investigators still question whether the act has been stretched beyond its original intent, or whether its very flexibility is what makes it dangerous. There's a strange rhythm to trials like this, almost like music in reverse. Instead of beats per minute, you hear charges per count. Instead of choruses, you hear repeated phrases like pattern of coercion and abuse of power. The prosecution plays the track of alleged misdeeds, while the defense samples a counter-rhythm, that everything was consensual, exaggerated, or twisted by people looking for financial payout. You're stuck in the middle, caught between two sound systems blasting conflicting truths. History gives you context. In 1920, the Mann Act was used against Charlie Chaplin, the silent film icon, accused of transporting an underage girl. He was acquitted, but his reputation never fully recovered. That odd tidbit surfaces now, reminding you how often American culture collides with its idols through the courts. Music, movies, sports. Different stages, same fall from grace. The defense leans hard into image management. They remind jurors that Combs has been a philanthropist, a father, a businessman who helped shape modern music. They argue that prosecutors are criminalizing what amounts to adult excess. It's not trafficking, they say, it's consensual entertainment. They paint him less as a predator and more as a man whose fame attracted opportunists. You notice the deliberate phrasing, designed not just for jurors but for the court of public opinion, where headlines matter almost as much as verdicts. Still, the dance floor imagery haunts this section of his life. Where once Diddy choreographed a spectacle with lights, beats, and bottles, now he sits motionless under fluorescent bulbs, listening as lawyers dissect his private life. Witnesses speak about flights to exotic locations, late-night parties, hotel suites that blurred the line between personal indulgence and corporate performance. What once was sold as entertainment now reappears as evidence. The irony bites. The same events that built his legend may be the ones that unravel it. There's a fringe detail too strange to ignore. During one recess, a reporter swore she overheard a juror humming a familiar tune, one of Combs' early hits, as if muscle memory couldn't resist. That image sticks. A juror carrying the soundtrack of the defendant into deliberations. It's not in the record, but you know it reveals something essential. Separating art from artist is harder than the law pretends. The transformation from mogul to defendant is stark. Gone are the velvet ropes, the bottles of Ciroc, the tailored jackets with diamond pins. In their place, court-issued wristbands, water pitchers, whispered sidebars. The man, once seated at the head of VIP tables, now leans toward his attorney, trying to decode whether jurors believe him or not. It's a brutal reminder that power, once absolute in music, dissolves under fluorescent lights and federal procedure. As you listen, you sense the broader cultural impact. Hip-hop, a genre built on resistance, excess, and spectacle, now faces a trial that might redefine its boundaries. If its moguls are dragged into court under racketeering and Mann Act charges, the very mythology of the music shifts. From Biggie's streets to Diddy's boardrooms, the arc was always about rising above. But this feels like a collapse inward. So you linger in this paradox. The man who taught the world to dance is now forced to sit still. His soundtrack is replaced by stenographer's keys, his beats by the dull rhythm of legal arguments. You feel the tension hang in the air, and you realize this isn't just his trial. It's the trial of celebrity power itself. You're standing in a dimly lit recording studio. The smell of old wood, coffee, and cigarette smoke lingers. The walls are padded with foam to capture every beat, every whispered lyric. But tonight, the room isn't alive with music. It's alive with accusation. In testimony after testimony, accusers describe these spaces not as creative sanctuaries, but as cages, where power dictated every note and every move. The studio, once celebrated as the birthplace of platinum hits, is now framed as the backdrop of exploitation. You listen as witnesses recall nights that began with recording sessions and ended in blurred lines. Business intertwined with intimacy, consent questioned, and money always hovering like a shadow. Prosecutors argue that the same walls that kept sound in also kept secrets from spilling out. These rooms, they say, became controlled environments where Combs's power was amplified not by speakers, but by fear. The defense, of course, rejects that portrait. They say the women came willingly, adults in the world of entertainment where blurred boundaries are almost an expectation. Investigators still question whether what happened here was coercion masked as glamour, or glamour weaponized into coercion. There's a historical resonance here. Recording studios have long been mythologized as creative havens, but they've also been crucibles of control. Think of Phil Spector's Wall of Sound. Innovative, but also allegedly oppressive to the musicians who worked under him. Stories swirl of artists trapped in contracts, studios doubling as prisons. That history now echoes in these allegations, where the magic of music is twisted into the mechanics of manipulation. You can almost hear the sounds, the faint hum of bass, the click of a metronome, the distant laughter of hangers-on. But layered over those noises are darker whispers. Testimonies about security guards outside the door, assistants fetching drinks, cameras recording encounters. One detail lingers. A former employee testifying that they were told to erase footage one morning, though no hard evidence of deletion was ever recovered. A fringe detail, but one that fuels suspicion and keeps jurors leaning forward. In this part of the trial, you sense the prosecution's strategy. Transform places of creativity into places of captivity. They paint a picture where music wasn't just produced, but people were too. Produced, controlled, distributed. The metaphor is deliberate, unsettling, and sticky in the imagination. And it works, at least in terms of atmosphere. The defense strikes back, hammering at inconsistencies. They highlight contracts, payments, and social media posts showing smiles and champagne, not fear. They argue that revisiting those nights years later creates distorted memories. They point to the allure of lawsuits and settlements. They want jurors to believe the closed doors were private but consensual, messy but not criminal. And you're left weighing both sides, realizing how much of this case relies not on physical evidence but on the perception of power. Was the studio a palace or a trap? A creative hub or a crime scene? The answer may lie in how jurors interpret silence, absence, and atmosphere. Outside the courthouse, the debate rages too. Fans argue online, combing through old lyrics for clues, quoting interviews where Diddy bragged about marathon sessions. Some insist the allegations match the persona he projected all along. Others defend him fiercely, claiming the government is vilifying another black mogul who disrupted traditional business. The trial becomes not just a legal proceeding, but a cultural referendum. And then there's the quirky, almost absurd. One journalist reports that during testimony about soundproof doors, a juror leaned forward and tapped the wood panel of the jury box as if to check its acoustics. It's a moment that doesn't change the case, but it reveals the human curiosity inside even the most solemn spaces. So here you sit, in the imagined hush of a studio that once vibrated with hits. Now, in whispered testimony and cold transcripts, it resonates with something heavier. You can't unhear the tension. Behind closed studio doors, music and power intertwined, and now, in open court, the world is left to decide whether what emerged was art or abuse. You're seated on a hard wooden bench watching one person after another walk to the stand. The air is thick with anticipation, as if the silence itself weighs 100 pounds. More than 30 witnesses take their turn under the fluorescent lights, their stories threading together a picture that's either damning or deeply contested. You listen as the prosecution builds its case not from a single smoking gun, but from an accumulation of voices. Voices that, if believed, could bury a mogul beneath their collective weight. Each witness adds a piece to the puzzle. Some describe flights arranged on short notice with hotels waiting like silent accomplices. Others recall moments in suites where the boundary between music making and private life vanished. A former assistant recalls scheduling meetings that weren't business at all. A security guard describes being ordered to stand outside and don't come in. A musician remembers seeing women leave in tears, even as music boomed from the speakers. None of these accounts alone proves guilt, but stacked together, they create an atmosphere heavy enough to crush denial. The cross-examinations are sharp, designed to slice holes in those stories. Defense attorneys bring up contracts, NDAs, and payments, suggesting motives rooted in money rather than truth. They point to inconsistencies, different dates, fuzzy memories, contradictions between witnesses. You hear them lean on the idea that fame attracts opportunists, and that Diddy is a target precisely because of his wealth. It's a strategy as old as the courtroom itself. Attack credibility, create doubt, and hope jurors latch onto even a shred of uncertainty. But the witnesses don't vanish under pressure. Some falter, yes, voices trembling, timelines blurring, but others stand firm. Eyes locked on the jury. They speak about fear, about coercion that didn't look like movie-style violence but felt like a cage made of money and influence. Investigators still question whether that fear was real or reframed by hindsight. Yet the stories stick. In the quiet between testimonies, you can almost feel the jury absorbing not just facts, but emotions. History provides a mirror here. In the 1990s, Anita Hill testified before Congress about sexual harassment by Clarence Thomas. Her testimony didn't stop his confirmation, but it sparked a cultural reckoning. In 2018, Christine Blasey Ford did the same during Brett Kavanaugh's hearings. Testimony alone can change the national conversation, regardless of the verdict. In this trial, the witnesses collectively become part of that lineage. Ordinary people pulling a powerful man into account through their words. Fringe details surface in these sessions, too. One witness, a backup singer, describes how she used to hum gospel tunes to herself in the bathroom to stay calm after tense nights. The odd specificity of that memory lingers, a reminder that trauma often shows itself through small rituals. Another tells the jury she remembers the brand of bottled water handed to her before an alleged encounter, not because it mattered, but because she clutched it like a lifeline. These fragments may seem trivial, but they add texture, making stories feel real in ways documents cannot. The defense pushes back, insisting these are rehearsed performances. They highlight the time gap, events allegedly from decades ago resurfacing only when lawsuits or indictments appear. They ask the jury whether memory is trustworthy after so many years, especially when fame, money, and resentment distort perception. And you find yourself nodding to the difficulty of the question. Memory is fragile, evidence is messy, but truth still demands to be chased. In between testimonies, the courtroom itself feels like it's inhaling and exhaling with each story. Reporters scribble notes, sketch artists capture the flick of an eyebrow, the slump of shoulders, the way jurors glance sideways at each other. Outside, fans argue on sidewalks, live streaming their opinions as if they too are part of the trial. The witnesses' words ripple far beyond the courtroom walls. You can't help but feel the collective weight. One voice might bend under scrutiny, but 30 create gravity. Whether that gravity drags Combs down or not is up to the jury. But you sense that his defense team knows this is the trial's center of mass. The government doesn't need every witness to be flawless. It needs the jury to believe that, on balance, the stories converge into a disturbing pattern. And so you lean back, almost dizzy from the chorus of testimonies. The beats of old songs echo faintly in your memory, but now they're drowned out by words, accusations, and emotion. For years, Diddy controlled the soundtrack. Now, the witnesses control the narrative, and the courtroom is forced to listen. You step outside the courthouse, and the noise hits you like a tidal wave. Reporters jostle for position, microphones angled high, cameras blinking red lights into the faces of anyone who looks remotely important. The trial of Sean Diddy Combs isn't just happening inside those wood-paneled walls. It's unfolding in real time across Twitter threads, TikTok sound bites, YouTube breakdowns, and live streams where strangers argue as if they themselves sit on the jury. The spectacle recalls older media frenzies. The O.J. Simpson trial in 1995, where helicopters hovered over freeways. The Michael Jackson cases, where throngs of fans camped outside with posters. Even the Casey Anthony trial, where TV anchors built entire careers off daily courtroom drama. This case joins that lineage, and you realize the public is no longer just an audience. They're participants shaping perception, feeding the algorithm, and tilting the cultural scales of guilt and innocence. Outside the courthouse, clusters of fans chant Diddy's name, clutching old vinyl records and posters from the Bad Boy era. Just a few steps away, protesters hold signs demanding justice for victims of powerful men. The clash is surreal. One side plays snippets of "I'll Be Missing You" from a Bluetooth speaker, while the other side shouts over it with megaphones. Investigators still question whether this divided street theater influences jurors. Officially, they're instructed to ignore outside noise, but humans rarely live in isolation. Mainstream outlets compete for dominance. CNN airs panel debates dissecting every testimony. TMZ chases the more salacious details. Rolling Stone publishes long-form pieces about the broader implications for hip-hop culture. Meanwhile, fringe YouTubers spin conspiracies about shadowy government plots, insisting the trial is a distraction from real scandals. A podcaster claims to have inside sources, only to be debunked hours later. Yet misinformation spreads faster than corrections, and you notice how even skeptical viewers start to absorb fragments of falsehood. There's a quirky moment, too. A street vendor sets up shop right by the courthouse, selling t-shirts emblazoned with "Bad Boy on Trial" in neon fonts. Another hustles glow sticks and bottled water, treating the trial like it's a summer festival. Someone even hands out free mixtapes remixed with courtroom sound bites, as if tragedy and entertainment can be blended into the same beat. It's absurd, even grotesque, but it underlines how spectacle warps everything it touches. Every evening, news anchors recap the day's events with dramatic pauses, as if narrating a true crime docuseries. Hashtags trend, memes proliferate, and people who have never listened to a Diddy track in their lives now suddenly debate his innocence or guilt at dinner tables. You sense how public opinion becomes a parallel court, one without rules of evidence, where charisma and sound bites often outweigh facts. And yet, amid the noise, survivors' voices still carry. Clips of witness testimony circulate online, spliced into TikTok reels with captions like, "She was so brave," or "Does this sound rehearsed?" These fragments shape narratives beyond what jurors hear. For younger audiences who never lived through the golden age of bad boy records, the case isn't about nostalgia. It's about reckoning with how power hides in plain sight. The courthouse itself becomes a stage. Reporters wait for Diddy's arrival each morning, cameras flashing as he steps out of sleek cars in carefully chosen suits. Some interpret his fashion as a power move, others as defiance. Social media dissects his expressions. Did he smirk? Did he look tired? Did his bodyguards block too much of the camera shot? Every gesture is magnified until it becomes part of the trial itself. The circus isn't confined to America either. British tabloids frame it as America's Me Too trial in hip-hop. French magazines debate whether separating art from artist is even possible. Nigerian outlets emphasize Diddy's ties to Afrobeats and how the case reverberates across global music. This is King T just a trial in New York, it's a trial in the court of global opinion, translated into dozens of languages, refracted through cultural lenses far beyond U.S. borders. You stand in the crowd for a moment, overwhelmed by the contradictions. This is a story about alleged crimes, victims, and accountability. And yet, it has also become theater, entertainment packaged for mass consumption. You wonder if justice can truly emerge from under the bright lights, or if it gets drowned out in the static of clicks, shares, and viral outrage. The circus drums on, day after day, making the trial feel less like a search for truth and more like a battle for narrative supremacy. And in that battle, you realize nobody, not even the jury, escapes untouched. You follow the scent of money because that's where this story thickens. In the trial of Sean Diddy Combs, the paper trail takes on as much importance as the testimonies. Prosecutors lean into bank statements, contracts, and tax filings, painting the picture of a man whose empire wasn't just built on music, but on an intricate web of corporate shells and hidden flows of cash. To understand the allegations, you have to map not just who said what, but who got paid, when, and why. Diddy's business history is legendary in hip-hop circles. Bad Boy Entertainment, founded in 1993, reshaped the music landscape, launching artists like the Notorious B.I.G., Faith Evans, and 112. At the height of its power, the label was pulling in millions, and Diddy himself expanded into clothing, vodka branding, and television ventures. The mainstream fact here is that Forbes once placed him at the very top of its richest in hip-hop wait list, estimating his net worth at over $700 million by 2017. His brand was never just about music, it was about diversification. But diversification can blur lines. Prosecutors claim those blurred lines became opportunities to obscure payouts. They present jurors with transfers routed through offshore accounts, shell companies registered in Delaware, and consulting fees that investigators still question whether they were legitimate services or fronts for silencing accusers. Defense attorneys counter that such arrangements are standard in the entertainment industry, where complex royalties, licensing deals, and cross-border collaborations are the norm. The quirky tidbit comes from a single exhibit, a framed $1 bill. Years ago, Diddy signed it during a Bad Boy studio session, calling it the first dollar that symbolized his business hustle. That dollar hung on his office wall for decades, but now prosecutors mention it in court, half sarcastically, as the symbolic beginning of a financial empire under scrutiny. You can imagine jurors smirking at the irony. What becomes clear is how money acts as both shield and sword. Lawyers are expensive, investigators even more so, and when allegations first surface, high-profile defendants often have the resources to mount counter-narratives swiftly. Payments labeled as settlements are scrutinized. Were they hush money, or simply the industry's way of avoiding drawn-out civil disputes? One set of documents reveals a consulting retainer, paid monthly to an associate who, curiously, has no visible history of consulting work. The defense insists these were legitimate mentoring arrangements. The prosecution implies otherwise. As the testimony continues, experts explain to jurors how financial crimes often overlap with allegations of abuse. Think back to Al Capone, taken down not for murder, but for tax evasion. The historical echo is strong. Follow the money, and you find the hidden truth. Here, prosecutors are betting that jurors will see irregularities not as business quirks, but as patterns of concealment. Fans outside debate the numbers too, though most have little grasp of the complexities. Some insist Diddy is just being punished for his success, that wealthy black entrepreneurs are always targeted. Others argue that the very wealth and fame he built insulated him from scrutiny for decades. Both narratives swirl, and social media makes it hard to distinguish between evidence and opinion. Investigators also surface odd expenses: private flights logged under entertainment budgets, lavish parties coded as business development, gifts to insiders recorded as marketing costs. On one line item, there's even a six-figure expense listed only as hospitality. Jurors raise eyebrows at that one, though the defense waves it off as a common industry term. Yet, the ambiguity itself becomes part of the case. Prosecutors want you to see vagueness as deliberate fog. The broader context is chilling. Across entertainment history, money trails often reveal how power shields itself. Elvis Presley's manager, Colonel Tom Parker, skimmed profits for years. Motown's contracts left artists with crumbs while executives thrived. Hollywood producers buried settlements in company ledgers. The Diddy case slots into that continuum of money as both a driver of success and a mask for shadows. You imagine jurors holding those thick binders of financial evidence, each page heavy with numbers, but behind every number is a human story. Someone who was paid off, someone who was silenced, or perhaps someone whose testimony never reached daylight because a signature was exchanged for silence. The courtroom becomes not just a place of legal judgment, but an accounting ledger where morality is measured in dollars and cents. The trail keeps winding, and the question becomes not just whether laws were broken, but whether morality was commodified. And that question, hanging heavy over the courtroom, refuses to balance neatly on any ledger. You sit in the courtroom gallery, but the trial feels like a summit of hip-hop history. On one side, Diddy's allies trickle in, some with solemn faces, others with an air of defiance. On the other, industry rivals hover on the sidelines, weighing whether this public unraveling might tilt the balance of power in their favor. The trial isn't just about legal guilt. It's about reputations, loyalties, and the shifting tectonics of celebrity influence. In hip-hop, alliances are often as fragile as glass. You recall the historic feud between East Coast and West Coast rappers in the 1990s, a cultural earthquake that ended in tragedy with the murders of Tupac Shakur and the Notorious B.I.G. That mainstream fact still echoes in every courtroom mention of bad boy records. Diddy built his empire in that volatile period, when a friend or an enemy could change your career overnight. Now, decades later, those dynamics reappear in subtler ways as artists, producers, and executives decide whether to publicly support him or stay silent. Celebrity allies step forward cautiously. A few current chart toppers release carefully worded statements about presuming innocence until proven guilty. Others stay vague, expressing love for the culture without naming Diddy at all. Investigators still question whether behind-the-scenes lobbying is happening. Whispers of phone calls to journalists, favors exchanged to mute criticism, or NDAs tightening the silence of former collaborators. Then there are the rivals, some smiling quietly from the shadows. You notice the schadenfreude in how certain industry figures comment on social media, framing the trial as proof that old gatekeepers are finally losing their grip. An outspoken former producer recalls how Diddy allegedly robbed artists on contracts, resurrecting grievances long thought buried. Even a few retired artists resurface, taking interviews with nostalgic but cutting remarks. He had his time. The game's different now. The quirky tidbit here is the presence of one pop star who shows up uninvited, just to be seen. Cameras catch them striding past the courthouse steps, sunglasses oversized, holding a coffee cup with "Free Love" scribbled in Sharpie. Nobody asked them to be there. They just couldn't resist the circus. Later, they post an Instagram story tagging the courthouse as if it were a trendy club. The stunt goes viral, part performance art, part opportunism. But the bigger picture is about influence networks. Celebrities function like amplifiers. When they speak, millions listen. Prosecutors understand this, so they subtly highlight how some allies seem to downplay the seriousness of allegations. The defense, meanwhile, embraces the presence of supportive stars, using their appearances to suggest Diddy still commands respect. Both sides know that jurors, despite instructions, cannot fully block out the glow of celebrity endorsements. Outside the courtroom, fan factions mirror the divide. Some post old videos of Diddy dancing in shiny suits, arguing he brought joy to their youth and deserves loyalty. Others reply with clips of victims' testimonies, insisting no amount of nostalgia should outweigh pain. The clash is messy, a digital proxy war fought in comment sections and hashtags. Historical echoes surface again. Think of Roman gladiators, celebrity warriors cheered or jeered by the crowd. Or consider the Hollywood blacklist of the 1950s, when one star's political affiliations determined whether colleagues would stand beside them or vanish for self-protection. The Diddy trial sits at that same strange crossroads of morality and career calculus. Who risks reputation by speaking up, and who seizes the moment to distance themselves? The alliances feel slippery, transactional. A rival mogul, once seen as untouchable, now faces quiet rumors that his empire might be next. Meanwhile, younger artists frame the trial as proof of generational change, declaring that hip-hop should no longer be controlled by men of Diddy's era. This isn't just a trial, it's a power shift playing out live, where silence, statements, and subtle gestures all carry weight. As you listen to the chatter, you realize something unsettling. In the court of celebrity, loyalty is never about truth. It's about timing, perception, and survival. And the trial forces every famous acquaintance to choose a side, or pretend they have none. You feel the tension thicken as the courtroom braces for the moment everyone has been anticipating: sentencing. The jury has spoken on 2 Mann Act violations and cleared Diddy on racketeering charges. Outside, whispers of shock and outrage ripple through the crowd. You sense the weight pressing on every shoulder in the room, knowing that decades of influence, empire building, and public persona now hang in the balance. The stakes are no longer just legal. They are symbolic, cultural, and deeply personal. The legal framework for sentencing under the Mann Act can be severe. Historically, defendants have faced multi-year prison terms, fines, and probation, depending on the specifics of transport, coercion, and previous convictions. Prosecutors argue that Diddy's influence and wealth necessitate a sentence that sends a clear message. No one is untouchable, not even a mogul with platinum hits, vodka brands, and international recognition. Investigators still question whether the recommended sentence will truly deter similar alleged behavior in the entertainment industry, or merely act as a spectacle. Inside the courtroom, defense attorneys lean forward, their voices calm but deliberate. They remind the judge of Diddy's contributions to music and philanthropy, portraying him as a figure who has not only shaped culture but also given back to communities. They plead for leniency, suggesting that time already served in pre-trial proceedings, coupled with a commitment to rehabilitation and community service, should weigh heavily in the judge's decision. You notice how carefully they balance acknowledging the jury's verdict while still framing their client as deserving of mercy. Historical parallels emerge in your mind. Consider R. Kelly, convicted years prior for sex crimes. His sentencing became a lightning rod for public discourse on accountability, celebrity, and cultural responsibility. Phil Spector, too, faced years in prison for murder after decades of musical innovation. These cases demonstrate how sentencing serves not only as punishment, but as a cultural symbol, shaping collective understanding of justice. In Diddy's case, the symbolic weight is amplified because of the combination of fame, wealth, and allegations spanning multiple states. A quirky and almost absurd detail arises during the sentencing hearing. A court clerk tasked with distributing folders to jurors accidentally hands one folder upside down. No one comments, but the subtle disorientation seems to mirror the larger chaos of the trial, the sense that even small errors ripple through a system already stretched to its limits. Outside the courthouse, reporters speculate endlessly. Headlines alternately emphasize leniency and harshness, framing the eventual sentence as either a miscarriage of justice or a triumph for accountability. Social media erupts with debates, memes, and tributes, all filtered through subjective moral lenses. You realize that sentencing is not merely a judicial act, it's a performance, a moment where law, culture, and public sentiment intersect in unpredictable ways. There's also a tension between deterrence and rehabilitation. Prosecutors stress that a firm sentence is necessary to send a warning across the entertainment industry, hoping to influence behavior and highlight the seriousness of consent violations. Defense attorneys counter that punitive measures alone cannot address systemic issues, emphasizing restorative justice and cultural education. Investigators still question whether the court will adequately balance these competing priorities, particularly given the high-profile nature of the defendant. Financial considerations subtly linger in the background. Diddy's empire is vast, and while prison time may restrict personal freedom, it cannot easily dissolve business interests. Lawyers debate whether fines or asset restrictions should accompany incarceration, and you sense a subtle negotiation in the air, invisible to the public, but vital to how justice will ultimately be administered. The human element persists amid legal strategy. Diddy appears composed outwardly, but his posture, his brief glances at the jury, and the slight tremor in his hands during statements suggest an awareness of gravity. Witnesses who faced the court earlier now watch silently, their expressions inscrutable. The balance of fear, relief, and satisfaction is delicate, a psychological landscape as tense as any nightclub he once ruled. You realize that this section of the story, the sentencing, is where narrative, morality, and legality converge. It is a crucible, testing not only Diddy's fate but also the cultural willingness to confront complicated questions about celebrity, power, and accountability. Whatever happens in the next hours or days will echo far beyond Manhattan, reaching fans, critics, and historians alike. You sit back and imagine the courtroom quiet after the initial shock of sentencing. But the story doesn't end there. Appeals loom like storm clouds over Manhattan, a reminder that in high-profile trials, one verdict is rarely the final word. The legal system is a chessboard, each motion, filing, and hearing a calculated move, and you can almost see attorneys across the table plotting several steps ahead, anticipating counter-arguments, and weighing public opinion. Appeals in cases like Diddy's are common. Historically, Mann Act convictions have been overturned or reduced on technical grounds, procedural errors, or new interpretations of consent laws. Prosecutors expect defenses to scrutinize every word, every affidavit, and every courtroom procedure. Investigators still question whether certain testimony could be deemed inadmissible on appeal, or whether juror instructions were sufficiently clear. The back and forth is meticulous, almost surgical, because one misstep could shift a multi-million-dollar empire and a public narrative that has already been shaped by weeks of testimony. You consider the chess-like strategies. Defense teams often target evidentiary inconsistencies, argue that past consensual interactions were misrepresented, and examine whether statute applications were correct. Meanwhile, prosecutors double down, preparing briefs to defend the lower court's findings, citing precedents, and pointing to financial records and multiple corroborating testimonies. Every legal maneuver is a calculated risk designed to sway appellate judges who have no exposure to the spectacle outside these pages and courtrooms. Fringe details emerge here too. One legal analyst jokingly calls it the Beyoncé move, referencing the power of indirect influence in courtroom perception. The phrase sticks in your mind because it underscores how pop culture language infiltrates even the most formal judicial spaces. Judges themselves might chuckle privately at colorful metaphors in filings or commentary. But the procedural precision never wavers. History is instructive. In 2008, R. Kelly appealed parts of his convictions, managing temporary reprieves, though ultimately failing to overturn core rulings. Phil Spector's appeals dragged on for years before being resolved. Each example reinforces a lesson. High-profile figures often leverage legal expertise, capital, and timing to challenge verdicts, and outcomes can be as much about process as substance. Media coverage doesn't pause. Analysts dissect appellate filings line by line, speculating whether Diddy's legal team can sway interpretations of consent or financial maneuvering. Twitter threads explode with breakdowns, podcasts offer multi-hour dissections, and YouTube channels produce visual timelines tracing every filing. You sense that the public appetite for this case doesn't diminish simply because the trial phase ends. If anything, it intensifies during appeals. There's an interesting quirk in the appellate process. Unlike trial testimony, appeals are almost entirely text-based. No witnesses, no live drama, just lawyers and judges parsing language. Yet the stakes feel identical, because the interpretation of a single word or phrase can change a sentence or overturn a conviction. You realize that in law, as in music production, nuance is everything. A misplaced note or a misphrased clause can reverberate far beyond the initial setting. You also notice the psychological weight on everyone involved. Defense teams burn out poring over transcripts, prosecutors wrestle with the moral imperative of enforcing the law, and the public debates endlessly online. Meanwhile, Diddy himself becomes a case study in resilience, or endurance, bearing the cumulative stress of scrutiny, past fame, and ongoing legal jeopardy. Investigators still question whether such pressure shapes behavior in the courtroom, potentially influencing testimonies and interpretations. The chessboard analogy extends beyond lawyers. Witnesses remain available for consultation, jurors reflect on prior testimony, and even celebrity allies watch to gauge how public sentiment might shift. Every move, motion for rehearing, request for reduced sentence, or challenge to evidentiary rulings is a calculated piece in a larger strategy that spans months, possibly years. You understand finally that appeals are not just about overturning verdicts, they are about narrative control. Winning an appeal can restore public image, retain wealth, and even reshape cultural perception. Losing can cement reputations, both negative and positive, in permanent memory. For Diddy, the next chapters of this legal drama will be written not in the glare of cameras, but in the meticulous margins of appellate briefs, with millions watching quietly, waiting for the judge's next move. You step back and look beyond the courthouse, beyond the media circus, beyond the legal chessboard. This trial is no longer just about Sean Diddy Combs. It has become a lens through which America and the world examines celebrity power, consent, and accountability. You see debates spilling into classrooms, podcasts, boardrooms, and living rooms. People dissect lyrics, business deals, and public personas as if moral calculus could be derived from entertainment history. The ripple effects are enormous. Historically, celebrity trials have served as cultural touchstones. The O.J. Simpson case in the 1990s didn't just deliver a verdict. It forced conversations about race, fame, and justice. Michael Jackson's trials shaped public understanding of allegations against iconic figures. In the present case, investigators still question whether cultural attitudes toward wealth and influence perceptions of accountability, and whether this trial might recalibrate those attitudes in the music industry and beyond. You notice subtle shifts. Record labels review artist contracts more closely, prompting discussions about consent, boundaries, and workplace ethics. Young artists begin questioning the mentor-protege relationships they've always assumed were harmless, wondering whether fame can sometimes cloak coercion. Music journalists, once focused solely on hits and tours, now scrutinize the industry's power structures, pointing out patterns that were previously overlooked. Fringe cultural phenomena appear too. Meme pages repurpose courtroom images into absurd comic strips, but even these jokes carry a meta-commentary, a reflection of society processing trauma and scandal through humor. One particularly viral meme pairs Diddy's courtroom expression with a famous scene from The Godfather, suggesting that the cultural mythos around him is as potent as the allegations themselves. These tangents are trivial on the surface but illustrate how culture digests high-profile cases in multiple layers simultaneously. Fans respond in fragmented ways. Some continue to idolize Diddy, arguing that music, philanthropy, and past inspiration outweigh allegations. Others pivot sharply, using the trial to interrogate the broader culture of exploitation in entertainment. Social media becomes an unofficial archive of public sentiment, capturing the contradictions, empathy, and outrage in real time. The case becomes as much about audience perception as legal outcome. There's also global impact. International music markets notice the trial's influence on brand partnerships, festival bookings, and cross-cultural collaborations. European and African outlets highlight how the case resonates with local conversations about celebrity misconduct. Investigators still question whether the trial's cultural impact will have lasting legal implications beyond the U.S., particularly in how artists' contracts and consent agreements are drafted worldwide. History repeats itself in subtle ways. Think of Phil Spector. Decades of influence, an empire built on production, and then a criminal conviction that reshaped how producers and artists navigated power dynamics. In Diddy's case, the same trajectory seems plausible. Even if some charges are overturned, the cultural conversation itself leaves a mark. Future musicians will grow up in an industry now aware of scrutiny at every level, where mentorship, fame, and power are inseparable from ethical accountability. Quirky details punctuate the cultural reverberations. A TikTok trend emerges where creators reenact court moments with stuffed animals, turning complex legal proceedings into digestible, humorous vignettes. You realize that in some strange way, humor helps the culture process complexity and grief simultaneously, an echo of the absurdity that accompanies real human tragedy. The trial reshapes language too. Terms like Mann Act, racketeering, and coercion enter mainstream vocabulary, appearing in casual conversations where they previously would not have. Legal education, celebrity culture, and social commentary intertwine in ways that feel both accidental and inevitable. The courtroom has become a cultural amplifier, turning technical statutes into symbols of societal reckoning. And through it all, you sense a subtle but persistent truth. Celebrity isn't just about admiration. It has a magnifying glass. The mistakes, alleged or proven, are amplified. The consequences are broader than any one individual. The world watches not just for justice in a courtroom, but for lessons about power, consent, and responsibility. You take a quiet moment in the empty courtroom after the last witness has testified. The media frenzy has died down, and the echoes of arguments linger in the air. The trial of Sean "Diddy" Combs is more than a legal proceeding. It is a meditation on the intersection of fame, influence, and responsibility. You feel the weight of the case not just on him, but on an entire industry built on charisma, spectacle, and often unchallenged power. Power has always fascinated and corrupted. From the kings and moguls of history to the producers and label executives of modern music, influence can be intoxicating. Combs embodies this paradox. A man who built an empire, reshaped popular culture, and cultivated an image of unassailable coolness. Yet, investigators still question whether the same power that created opportunity also facilitated alleged abuses, blurring the lines between mentorship, entitlement, and coercion. Historically, unchecked authority has rarely gone unchallenged. The rise of Me Too, along with prior trials of celebrities for misconduct, illustrates a slow cultural reckoning. No one is above accountability, regardless of wealth or fame. You recognize the pattern. Society tolerates charm and talent for a long time, but eventually systems of law and public opinion converge to demand consequences. The trial also reveals human contradictions. Fans, allies, and even critics wrestle with cognitive dissonance. Can one celebrate music while condemning the man behind it? Can admiration coexist with moral scrutiny? The quirky tidbit is how jurors and audiences alike sometimes hum or whistle. Combs' "yes" hits in private moments, a subconscious acknowledgement of the lasting power of his cultural contributions. Memory and melody refuse to vanish, even amid allegations. Accountability in this context is multifaceted. Legal consequences matter, yes, but so do cultural and personal reckonings. Investigators still question whether justice can ever be fully measured in jail time or fines, or whether the true measure lies in systemic change, contracts, mentorship practices, and the ways young artists are protected from exploitation. The trial, in its intensity, forces society to examine these questions, challenging norms and highlighting vulnerabilities within the entertainment industry. You sense a delicate balance between forgiveness and vigilance. History teaches that absolution is rarely simple. Reputation is shaped as much by perception as fact. The trial leaves an enduring question. How do we separate artistry from accountability, talent from transgression, and legend from legal liability? It is a question without easy answers, yet essential for a culture that consumes entertainment voraciously while venerating the individuals behind it. The courtroom itself seems to symbolize this tension. Once a space of absolute procedure and rules, it has also become a theater, a stage for the human drama of ambition, mistakes, and consequences. Witnesses, jurors, lawyers, and even the absent public become part of a narrative that stretches beyond the legal text into lived experiences, memory, and cultural identity. Quirky, human details punctuate this reflection. You remember a juror doodling musical notes in the margins of their notepad, an unconscious gesture linking the law to the art it examines. A clerk quietly rearranges folders on the judge's bench, reminding you that behind every high-profile trial are ordinary people performing mundane tasks that anchor reality. Finally, you confront the truth. Power and accountability are inseparable in this story. Fame amplifies mistakes. Wealth shields them temporarily, but the law and culture eventually intersect. The case of Diddy is both specific and emblematic, a reflection of the risks inherent in concentrated influence and the necessity of vigilance. It is a story of ambition, artistry, and the sobering consequences when boundaries are crossed, even if only allegedly. As you leave the empty courtroom, the echoes of basslines, testimonies, and deliberations linger together. You recognize that the legacy of the trial will not be measured in headlines alone, but in the lessons absorbed by a culture that witnessed both the heights of a music empire and the gravity of accountability. The story is neither simple nor complete, but it is indelibly instructive, leaving a quiet imprint on anyone who followed its rhythms. You settle into a quiet space, letting the intensity of the courtroom, media storm, and cultural debates fade like the final notes of a song. The trial of Sean "Diddy" Combs has unfolded across layers of law, fame, and public scrutiny, leaving traces of reflection in its wake. Now, in this calm, you can begin to absorb not just the events themselves, but the deeper questions they raise about power, responsibility, and human complexity. Take a moment to breathe. The story has been full of tension and contradiction, yet it also reminds you that accountability is rarely linear. Fame can distort perception, money can obscure boundaries, and culture can oscillate between reverence and outrage. You realize that learning from such cases is less about judgment and more about vigilance, about understanding how influence shapes behavior, and how systems of law and social awareness intersect to hold it in check. The human element resonates most strongly. Witnesses, jurors, lawyers, and even the accused are not abstractions. They are individuals navigating a labyrinth of consequence and morality. Investigators still question the edges of truth, knowing that memory, motive, and power influence every testimony. As an observer, you are reminded that empathy, critical thinking, and patience are essential when unraveling stories that are as messy as life itself. Outside the courtroom, the cultural ripples continue. Music, mentorship, and industry practices will all be touched by the trial's echoes. Fans and critics alike are forced to consider how admiration and accountability coexist, and how society must reckon with the tension between art and the artist. You notice that even amid controversy, the beats, lyrics, and stories that shaped an era persist, proof that culture is resilient, even when the figures behind it are questioned. Finally, you allow yourself a moment of quiet reflection. The story is complex, the players human, and the lessons enduring. Power carries responsibility, influence invites scrutiny, and even legends are subject to the rules that govern us all. It is a subtle reminder that accountability is never optional, and that the search for justice and understanding continues long after headlines fade. So, as you close your eyes and let the echoes settle, remember the layers of this story. Music, empire, allegations, and culture, all intertwined. In the calm, the lessons linger, resonating softly, like a familiar melody that prompts thought without forcing it, leaving space for reflection, understanding, and, ultimately, hope.